On the cold afternoon of February 14, 1892, a coal delivery man named Samuel Tate was driving his wagon along the narrow path beside Mill Creek. The air was freezing, and the creek's surface was covered in shiny ice. He was making his last delivery of the day, a few bags of coal for the Wickham house near the bend. Usually at this time, he would see the children playing outside. Clara, Henry, and little Elsie would be bundled up in their coats, and their laughter would carry across the water. But that day the yard was empty. The snow lay untouched except for Samuel's wheel tracks. All the shutters were closed. Not even a wisp of smoke was coming from the chimney. He knocked on the door with his gloved hand and waited. The only sound was the slow creak of a bare tree branch scraping against the side of the house. He tried again, knocking harder this time, and leaned closer. That was when he smelled it, a strange odor, faint at first, then impossible to ignore. It was sweet, almost like medicine, mixed with the stale smell of air that hadn't moved in weeks. Samuel's mouth went dry. He called out for Sarah, but there was no answer. By the time he climbed back onto his wagon, his mind was already thinking about the strange things he had noticed in recent weeks. The mail that hadn't been picked up at the general store, the windows that stayed shuttered even on mild days, the absence of the children's voices. That evening, sitting by his own kitchen stove, he told his wife he planned to speak with Sheriff Gley in the morning. Sheriff Albert Gley was 50 years old and had spent most of his career dealing with small arguments and the occasional fight at the town's saloon. His badge was more for keeping peace between neighbors than for real law enforcement, and he had known the Wickhams since before Thomas, the husband, died in a mill accident 3 years earlier. Sarah, he remembered, had been quiet but strong in the months after Thomas's death, always refusing offers of help with a polite shake of her head. He thought of her as a woman who knew how to survive hard times. Still, when Samuel Tate stood in his office the next morning, describing the smell and the silence, something in Gley's gut shifted. Mill Creek was a place where you could hear a dog bark half a mile away. For the Wickham house to become so quiet was not just unusual, it was unnatural. The sheriff got on his horse and rode out that afternoon. The ground was hard beneath the horse's iron shoes, and his breath created clouds in the cold air. The sky hung low and colorless, and the creek was frozen as it wound through the landscape. As he got closer to the bend, the Wickham house appeared through the bare trees. Its wooden walls were the grey color of old bone. He noticed right away that every window was sealed, and some had boards nailed across them that were visible even from the yard. The front steps had been cleared of snow, but the porch was empty. He got off his horse, his boots crunching on the frozen ground, and walked up the steps. The first knock sounded too loud in the silence. No answer. After the second knock, he heard the faintest sound of movement inside, as if someone had shifted their weight on the floorboards. Then the latch turned, and the door opened just a narrow gap. Sarah Wickham stood there, her thin frame inside a high-necked dress buttoned all the way to her throat. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes were shadowed in a way that made it hard to read her expression. "Sheriff," she said, her voice flat but polite. "Is there something you need?" He explained that the neighbors had been worried, that no one had seen the children. Her gaze moved past him toward the white field beyond, as though something far away held her attention. Then she said, "They're resting. Please don't wake them." The words hung in the air between them, too calm for the unease they carried. He asked if he could come inside. She stepped back without arguing. The air inside was heavy and colder than it should have been, even with a fire burning in the fireplace. Curtains were pulled tight. The living room was neat to the point of looking empty. No books left out, no boots drying by the door, no scattered toys. On the dining table, 4 plates were laid out, each empty and clean. From the corner of his vision, he saw a narrow staircase leading upward. Sarah's eyes followed his, and she shook her head almost imperceptibly. "Let them be," she murmured. "They've had enough of the world." That was the moment when Gley understood that something was deeply wrong in the Wickham house. But the full picture of that wrongness and the path that had led to it was still hidden. To uncover it, he would have to look back. Before the shutters, before the silence, before the winter pressed in. And that is where our story begins. If you find yourself drawn into this mystery, take a moment to share your thoughts and let others know what you think happened here. Your voice keeps these forgotten stories alive. Before the Wickham house became a shuttered outline against the winter fields, it had been a place of light. Sarah Ellen Reeves was 21 when she married Thomas Wickham, a mill worker at the wool factory that stretched its long brick building along the banks of Mill Creek. Thomas was 8 years older, with broad shoulders from years of lifting and setting the heavy beams that supported the mill's machinery. He had a calm manner and the kind of quiet patience that made him liked at work and trusted in the town. Sarah had been raised a few miles upriver on her father's small farm. She was the youngest of 5 children, the one her mother trusted with sewing, with keeping the lamp glass clean and the cupboards neat. Those skills served her well in the small white house Thomas rented from the mill's owner. The front porch looked down the slope to the creek, and in the warmer months she would leave the windows open to catch the sound of water flowing over the rocks. In the first years, their life had a simple rhythm. Thomas woke early, walked the half-mile to the factory, and returned at dusk with the smell of wool grease and sawdust clinging to him. Sarah kept the garden in straight rows, baked bread on Saturdays, and on Sundays they attended the small Methodist church at the Bend. She joined the ladies' sewing circle, and her laughter, though never loud, came easily then. Their first child, Clara, arrived in the summer of 1882, dark-haired baby with a stubborn gaze. 2 years later came Henry, fair-haired like his father, and in 1887, Elsie, whose small, delighted laugh could turn heads in the church pews. The Wickhams were not wealthy, but they were known for the neatness of their home and the bright clothes their children wore. In those days, Sarah moved easily among neighbors, trading recipes, sharing garden cuttings, and accepting the small loans and favors that passed quietly between young families. The change began not with tragedy, but with the slow build-up of stress. The factory took more of Thomas's time, extra shifts to meet production goals, repairs that kept him working until after dark. Sarah managed the children alone for longer stretches. The little house seemed to shrink in winter when cold pressed in through every crack. She wrote letters to her mother describing the children's achievements, but visits were rare. The road between Mill Creek and her parents' farm was long, and Sarah's father disliked traveling. Then, in March of 1889, the factory crane slipped while lifting a beam. Witnesses said Thomas had only a moment to shout before the timber swung wide, striking the platform where he stood. He fell 2 stories to the stone floor. The company's foreman came to the Wickham door with his hat in his hands. His words were careful, but nothing in them could soften what he had to say. Sarah's grief was quiet and controlled. She wore black, took care of the children, and accepted the small payment the mill's owner offered, enough to pay the rent for a year and buy coal for the winter. There were casseroles left on her porch in the weeks after the funeral, and the minister's wife visited twice with an offer to watch the children. Sarah thanked her and declined. By summer, she had decided to stay in the house. It was near the school, she told those who asked, and the garden would keep them fed. But she no longer joined the sewing circle, and she attended church less regularly. Some said it was the stress of raising 3 children alone. Others noticed the look in her eyes when someone asked about Thomas, how her gaze would fix just over their shoulder, as if looking at something they could not see. In that first year of being a widow, she kept up appearances. The children were clean, their clothes were mended, the house was neat. But she began to refuse invitations, preferring to stay within her own walls. It was during this time, years before the shutters were nailed in place, that her pattern of withdrawal began, almost invisible to those who passed her at the general store or along the path to the post office. The winter that followed would deepen that pattern, drawing her more tightly into the silence that would, in time, become her only companion. The first winter after Thomas's death settled over Mill Creek like an extra wall. Snow drifted against the wooden walls and pressed the hedges flat. Wind slipped between the boards and found the nail holes, as if the house were a musical instrument being tested for leaks. Sarah learned the sounds of the season, the small popping of a log as it caught fire, the soft clack of window panes when the wind changed direction, the dry whisper of wool when sleeves rubbed together in the doorway. She kept the children indoors more than before, explaining that the path to the creek was icy, that the air was biting, that the woodpile must last. No one argued with a mother in winter. At first, her choices seemed reasonable. She carefully rationed fuel, stitched quilts from old coats, and showed Clara how to dry orange peels on the stove to scent the room. There were still touches of the old Sarah in these months. The neat roll of her hair, the way she labeled the pantry jars in careful handwriting, the habit of turning each child's collar so it sat just right. But the longer the cold held on, the more her world collapsed inward. She slept in short bursts, sitting up to listen when the house settled. She began to speak of the walls as if they were protective hands. "The room will keep us," she told Henry when he asked about sledding with the neighbor boys. "The room knows what the winter takes." The neighbors noticed what winter always makes visible: patterns. Mrs. Penfield from across the lane left stew on her porch twice, wrapped in towels against the chill. Each time by nightfall the pot was gone. By morning the towels were folded neatly on her step. There was gratitude in the gesture, but also a limit, as if thanks could be delivered without opening a door. The postmaster, Mr. Lyle, mentioned to the minister that Sarah now only collected mail on Tuesdays, and only when no one else was in the shop. She would wait with her back to the stove and her eyes on the floor until the counter was clear. The school teacher, Miss Baird, recorded 3 absences for Clara and 2 for Henry in a single week, then crossed them out when Sarah appeared the next day with a note about coughs caused by a late frost. The ink blurred slightly where it met the paper, as though the page had been held too long in a damp hand. When the new year came and the creek went silent under thick ice, the Wickham house began to change its appearance. Curtains that once opened in the morning stayed closed. A thick shawl was nailed over the back door to keep the draft out. Cloth strips were laid along windowsills. These were practical things, easily excused. But there were other changes that were not so easily explained by winter's logic. Sarah stopped using the mirror in the front room. One afternoon, while returning a borrowed kettle, Mrs. Penfield glanced through the window and saw the mirror removed and propped like a shutter against the wall, its reflective surface turned backward. When asked about it later, Sarah answered gently, "Reflections double what we already have. We don't need more of anything this season." She also began to rename daily routines. Bedtime became the quiet, breakfast became the keeping, the walk to the woodpile became the careful. The children were practical about these changes. Children reshaped language without effort, and to them, the new names were a kind of game. But the habit marked a deeper shift, the way a river marks its edges when it swells, silent, steady, easy to miss if you only cross it once a week. By late January, visits became less frequent, not because neighbors didn't care, but because winter trains everyone to focus on their own home. When people from the church stopped by, they often found a note pinned to the front door, resting. Please leave any packages at the step. The handwriting remained firm, the letters straight. Yet something in the spacing changed, more air between words, as if she needed to slow down even the shapes of her thoughts. One Sunday after church service, the minister's wife sent her teenage son to carry kindling to the Wickhams. He returned saying he had heard a tune, faint and sung like a lullaby, coming from upstairs, though it was midday. Not a cheerful tune, he said at dinner, searching for the right words. Just soft, like someone humming with their teeth closed. His mother told him not to exaggerate and put the matter away. When the thaw teased but did not arrive, the children's friends began to report small, odd sightings that adults didn't know how to handle. A boy named Simon swore he saw Henry standing in the front window without moving for nearly an hour, his hands at his sides, his face pale. He didn't wave, Simon said. He just watched the road. Not me, the road. A girl from 2 houses over said she heard giggles from behind the hedge and found no one there. The hedge showed no footprints in the snow, and she was sent home with a scolding for wandering. Inside the Wickham house, the days took on a structure that, to Sarah, felt like safety. She woke before dawn and warmed milk with cinnamon if they had it. She measured coal with a small tin cup. 2 scoops for morning, 2 for dusk. And taught Clara to write out math problems on scrap envelopes so they could see that what they had would last. She read aloud from the one book she didn't put away. A Bible passed down from her mother, choosing passages about still waters and shade from heat. They were good hours. Elsie's hair drying into soft curls by the stove. Henry carving small boats from kindling. Clara mending a doll's dress and asking if stitches talk to each other when no one looks. Sarah smiled at that and answered, yes, but only in whispers. The first bottles arrived from the drugstore during this season. They were common things for the time, medicines recommended by neighbors for coughs and nerves, purchased carefully, with instructions folded into the wrapping. Laudanum appeared in many homes as winter medicine. It was neither secret nor rare, and the label sounded almost reassuring in their formal language. Sarah followed directions at first, measuring drops for a rattling chest or for an afternoon when Elsie couldn't settle down. The results were immediate and soothing. A child lulled to sleep, a room quieted, a span of hours smoothed as if by a gentle hand. In the margin of an old calendar she kept by the stove, she began to note small phrases. Slept well. Afternoon gentle. Henry, no cough. The marks were for herself alone, a mother's crude record against the disorder of winter. But not every measure was medicinal. Some were simply to hold the day in place. She learned that children sleep more easily when light is steady, that the eye seeks brightness and grows restless when it finds it. So she evened out the house. She hung a blanket over the one window that still let in a strip of sun across the floor at noon. She laid a second rug over the living room rug so footsteps wouldn't echo. She asked the children to speak in quiet voices because sound carries differently in winter and upsets the air. We let the house breathe, she told them. We keep it from being startled. They nodded the way children do when the rule sounds kind. By February, those outside the Wickham door began to speak of the family in the language of weather. Have you seen them? Became, are they keeping well? Is Sarah unwell? Became, is she wintering hard? Pity wrapped itself in polite phrases and shyness. There were no laws about visiting too much or not enough. There were only habits and unwritten rules of courtesy, and those tend to favor leaving people alone during their hardest times. One late afternoon, with the sky clear as glass and the cold sharp enough to make nails in the fence ring, Miss Baird made her way to the house with a bag of reading books and a small jar of jam. She had told herself she would stand firm at the door and insist on seeing the children. Not to judge, simply to check on them. But when Sarah opened the door at her knock, the teacher hesitated. The room behind her was dim, neat, and quiet in a way that felt tender rather than empty. Sarah's face was thinner. Her eyes were not red or swollen, only focused, as if on a string stretched tight between her and something in the middle distance. I brought reading books, Miss Baird said. Clara will get ahead of the class if she keeps reading at home, but I'd like Henry to keep up with his math. She tried a laugh that landed too softly. That's kind, Sarah said, and stepped aside just enough for the bag to pass through without letting the cold fully in. They're resting. The cold makes them forget the difference between night and day. I like to give them one more hour when I can. Perhaps I might look in, the teacher began. Perhaps another day. The refusal held a politeness that closed like a latch. Come when the creek runs again, Sarah said, and smiled the way people smile when they wish something could be true soon. That night the wind changed direction. The air carried smells not usually noticed. The metallic smell of cold water trapped beneath ice, the faint sweetness of medicine left uncorked, the scorched wool from mittens dried too close to the flame. Mr. Tate, returning late from a delivery to the far ridge, turned his head as he passed the Wickham yard and frowned, storing the scent in memory because that is what instinct taught him to do. In the morning, another small thing registered in the town's record of oddness. Mr. Lyle stacked 2 letters for Sarah behind the counter and marked her name in pencil on a third, an advertisement for seeds she would not plant. He looked at the calendar and tapped the square for Tuesday. If she didn't come that day, he told himself he would ask the minister to stop by again. And then a customer arrived with a broken strap and a story about his mule, and the thought drifted to the back of his mind where winter keeps such things until they are needed. Before the deep freeze broke, the pattern had hardened. The Wickham house was visited but not entered, spoken of but not directly addressed, watched but not truly seen. Inside, Sarah counted the beats of the day and wrote new names for them, certain that if she could keep the world measured, it would spare the 3 small lives entrusted to her. The creek would eventually move again. Spring always came. But the winter had already done its work. It had taught the town how to leave her be. It had taught Sarah how to close the windows. When the first thaw finally slicked the road and the icicles loosened, a series of small events would follow. Nothing spectacular, nothing loud. That together would show how far the season had carried them all. The thaw came hesitantly that year, as if the season feared it might be turned back. For days, the snow softened only at the edges, revealing strips of wet earth where grass lay yellowed and pressed flat. The creek began to murmur under its ice, a muted voice testing its strength. Sunlight returned in small ration doses, bright on the tin roofs at noon, gone by mid-afternoon. The first drips from the roof edges were slow and uncertain, like someone testing the water temperature before getting into a bath. For most households along Mill Creek, this shift meant a stirring to life. Children slipping outside to chase the melting water, women airing blankets from upper windows, men checking the sheds for winter damage. But the Wickham house stayed shuttered. The snow in their yard melted in uneven patches, as if the shadow of the house itself lingered longer than the sun's warmth. From the road, it was clear that no curtains had been pulled back to meet the light. One afternoon in early March, 10-year-old Clara was spotted by a boy named Matthew Penfield at the side of the house. She stood just beyond the corner, her hands inside a pair of mittens too large for her, looking down at something he couldn't see. He called her name once. She didn't answer. He took a step closer, and she turned her head in a slow, deliberate motion, her eyes fixing on him without surprise. "You'll wake them," she said. Then she stepped back until she was hidden by the wall. Matthew told his mother that evening. She told him it was likely nothing. Children say strange things when they've been kept indoors too long. Other children had their own small encounters. A girl named Ruth from 2 houses toward the bend claimed she had been playing near the fence when she heard someone humming. She peeked through a knothole and saw Elsie, the youngest Wickham, sitting cross-legged on the ground with her eyes closed, swaying gently. "She was making the same sound over and over," Ruth said later, like it was a song for no one. By the time she walked around to the gate to say hello, the yard was empty. The adults heard these stories with indulgent smiles or mild frowns. Children imagined things. Spring fever played tricks. Still, each account left a small weight in the listener's mind, the kind that doesn't vanish but only settles deeper. It was around this time that the minister's wife, Mrs. Hammond, decided to make a visit. She brought with her a loaf of brown bread and a small jar of pickled beans. The air was damp, the road soft underfoot. She knocked twice firmly. After a pause, the door opened just enough for Sarah to be seen. She was wearing a dark dress with sleeves buttoned at the wrist, her hair braided and wound at the back of her head. "Spring is near," Mrs. Hammond said, lifting the bread. "Thought you might use this and some beans. We've all been through the same winter." Sarah thanked her in a low voice and took the offerings without letting the door open wider. "The children?" Mrs. Hammond asked. "They're resting," Sarah replied, the same phrase she'd used before. "It's best to let them finish their rest. You know the Sunday school will start again after the thaw." "Yes," Sarah said, her gaze sliding down to the bread in her hands. "We'll see." And with that, the door closed, the latch catching softly. Hammond walked back down the lane, unsettled. She told herself that grief takes its own shape, and that perhaps Sarah would return when the season turned fully. Yet there was something in her manner, something not merely sad but enclosed, as if a wall had been built inside her, higher than any fence. A few days later, the first real break in the ice came. The creek's voice grew stronger, and small sheets of frozen crust broke loose and turned slowly toward the bend. In the bright glare of afternoon, Matthew Penfield's father noticed that one of the upstairs windows of the Wickham house had been covered not with cloth, but with thin boards nailed directly into the frame from the inside. The wood was raw and fresh, pale against the weathered siding. He mentioned it to Samuel Tate at the post office, and Samuel nodded, saying only that he'd seen the same on the backside a week ago. "That's not to keep weather out," Matthew's father said. Samuel shrugged in a way meant to end the subject. In small towns, certain conversations stopped themselves. The postmaster, Mr. Lyle, had his own quiet observation. Sarah's Tuesday visits for mail had ceased entirely. 3 letters for her now sat in a drawer, along with 2 advertisements and a package wrapped in brown paper that had come from a drugstore in Reading. The package had a faint smell of cloves and something sharper beneath it. One evening, as dusk slid over the fields, Henry was seen at the upstairs window by a passing farmhand. The boy was motionless, his face pale in the dim light, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the man's shoulder. The boards covered part of the glass, leaving a narrow gap through which Henry watched. The farmhand raised a hand in greeting. Henry did not move. By the end of March, these moments, The sightings, the strange phrases, the nailed boards had begun to form a pattern in the minds of those who noticed them. But each person kept their worries to themselves. The winter had trained them to keep their concerns quiet, to speak of the Wickhams in soft tones, if at all. It would take one more unsettling incident, small and almost easily dismissed, to push anyone toward action. And by then, the season for easy solutions would be nearly gone. It was a pale morning in early April when the incident happened. The sort of day when the ground was still damp from melted snow, but the air carried the promise of warmth. Mrs. Penfield had stepped out to sweep her porch when she noticed a small figure farther down the lane. At first, she thought it was one of the Hammond children on an errand, but as the shape drew closer, she saw it was Elsie Wickham. The girl was barefoot, her nightdress brushing her ankles, her hair uncombed and tangled over her shoulders. She moved without hurry, stepping carefully as if the road might break under her feet. Mrs. Penfield called to her, but Elsie didn't answer, only turned her head slightly, then continued toward the bend. Alarm pricked at the edges of the older woman's calm. She pulled on her shawl and walked quickly to catch up. "Ilse, dear, it's chilly. Where's your mother?" she asked, crouching to meet the girl's eyes. "She's sleeping," Elsie said simply. Her voice was soft, almost matter of fact. "We have to be quiet when she's sleeping." Mrs. Penfield glanced up the road toward the Wickham house, its windows still shuttered tight. "Well, let's get you back home before your feet catch cold." She took the child's hand. It was cool and dry. She began to lead her back. Halfway there, Elsie stopped and looked toward the field. "If we wake her, she cries," she said. "It's better when we don't." The words sat heavy between them. Mrs. Penfield said nothing more, only kept hold of her hand until they reached the steps of the Wickham house. She knocked twice. The door opened almost at once. Sarah stood there, her dress buttoned to the collar, her hair pinned neatly. Her eyes moved from Elsie to Mrs. Penfield without change in expression. "She knows better than to wander," Sarah said, her tone neither sharp nor grateful, simply flat. "Thank you for bringing her back." She reached for the child's hand and guided her inside. The door closed without another word. Mrs. Penfield remained on the step for a moment, her breath visible in the cool air, unsettled by the absence of what she had expected. No worry, no thanks, no surprise. She walked home slowly, telling herself that some mothers manage worry in their own ways. But when she tried to read her newspaper later, the image of Elsie's bare feet on the wet road kept returning, each time more out of place. That afternoon, the Penfields' farmhand, Will, passed by the Wickham house on his way to mend a fence. He saw later that he saw a blanket nailed across the inside of the front door. The blanket hung heavy, blocking the thin light from the window above the door. It was like they wanted to keep the day out. He said years afterward. News of the morning's oddness travelled quietly. At the post office the next day, Mrs. Penfield mentioned Elsie's walk to Mrs. Hammond, who pressed her lips together and said, "It's not the first time the children have been seen out alone, but no one yet called the sheriff." In 1892, a child wandering barefoot was curious, perhaps cause for neighbourly concern, but not for formal complaint. Mothers were trusted to know best, and privacy was guarded more fiercely than safety. Still, for those who had noticed, the unease began to take root. The image of the youngest Wickham child out on the road before breakfast lingered in minds, and with it came the thought, unspoken but shared, something inside that house was not as it should be. And then, as if to seal the sense that the Wickhams were slipping further from the reach of ordinary life, the shutters on the upper floor were nailed shut within the week. The pale wood of the boards caught the sunlight like a warning, though no one named it as such. People passed on their way to the mill or the store, glanced once, then fixed their eyes ahead. No one knew it yet, but the season for asking gentle questions had ended. What lay ahead would demand more than questions, though few in Mill Creek were ready to give what it required. By late April, Mill Creek had shaken off most of the winter. The ground was soft underfoot, the air mild enough that women hung laundry in the yards, and children returned to the dirt path beside the creek. Wildflowers sprouted along the fence lines, their colors flashing like small coins in the grass. In most homes, windows were open to let in the smell of damp earth and the hum of insects, but the Wickham house remained closed to the season. Sarah no longer came to collect her mail. Mr. Lyle, the postmaster, kept her letters and packages in a tidy stack behind the counter. Among them was a parcel from a shop in Harrisburg, heavy and wrapped in brown paper tied with thick string. It had been there nearly 3 weeks. Another smaller package arrived in early May from a drugstore in Reading. When the wrapping loosened slightly at one corner, the scent of cloves drifted out, mixed with something sharper, almost metallic. The general store clerk, William Hodge, remarked to a neighbor that Sarah's orders through the store had changed. Where she once purchased flour, sugar and soap, she now requested items like candle molds, black fabric in long lengths, spools of dark thread, and packets of dried herbs uncommon to most kitchens: wormwood, valerian, pennyroyal. The clerk packed these goods without comment. Customers chose what they chose, and it was not his place to question it. Still, he told his wife later that he couldn't remember the last time Sarah had bought anything for children. No paper, no chalk, no ribbon for Clara's hair. It was in the first week of May that someone from outside Mill Creek came close enough to glimpse inside the Wickham house. A traveling salesman named George Lynd had been working his way north from Lancaster, selling small mechanical coffee grinders. He carried samples in a polished case and relied on farm kitchens and living room visits to make his living. Late in the afternoon, looking for the quickest route to the next township, he spotted the Wickham house at the bend and turned up the path. As he climbed the porch steps, he heard a sound from within. A woman's voice, low and rhythmic, repeating a line he couldn't quite make out. He thought it might be a hymn. He knocked and the voice stopped. After a long pause, the door opened just enough for him to see a slice of the living room beyond. Sarah stood there, her dress dark, her hair drawn back. Her face was calm, but her eyes seemed to be searching for something over his shoulder. "Ma'am, I beg your pardon," Lynn began, tipping his hat. "Could you point me toward the road to Harrow's Crossing?" Sarah's gaze rested on him for a few seconds before she said, "South, where the road bends toward it." Then, without asking his purpose or offering courtesy beyond the words, she began to close the door. In that moment, Len's eyes flicked past her to the shadowed space behind. He thought he saw a figure, small, motionless, standing near the base of the stairs. The light was poor, and before he could be certain, the door shut. As he made his way back down the path, he noticed that the shutters on the upper windows were not just closed but secured with nails driven in at an angle, the pale heads catching the light. He felt a mild chill that had nothing to do with the weather and quickened his pace until the Wickham house was out of sight. When Len told the story later in the tavern at Harrow's Crossing, it drew only polite interest. No one there knew the Wickhams, and his account sounded more like a peddler's attempt at a fireside tale than a report worth passing to the authorities. But in Mill Creek, had it been heard, it might have added to the quiet record of unease already kept by those who lived within sight of the shuttered house. The weeks ahead would deepen that unease. What had been small, separate concerns, a barefoot child, a nailed window, an unfamiliar smell, would soon begin to feel like pieces of the same thing, a shape only visible when enough of it was drawn. And by then, the drawing would be nearly complete. By early June, summer was pressing in. The air along Mill Creek grew heavy with the smell of warm earth and the slow, sticky drift from pine boards stacked to dry behind the mill. Gardens across the township swelled with green, rows of beans climbing their stakes, squash vines curling between cabbages, the sharp smell of dill when someone brushed past in the narrow paths. But the Wickham yard lay still. The neat beds Sarah had kept in past years were overrun, the soil dry and crusted, a scatter of weeds leaning toward the road as if searching for light. People saw less of Sarah now than at any point since Thomas's death. Even those rare Tuesday walks to the post office had stopped entirely. Deliveries left at the porch vanished by the next day, but no one saw her collect them. In the church, her name remained on the roll, but the pew where she once sat with the children stayed empty. It was in the second week of June that the last known sighting of a Wickham child outdoors took place. Samuel Tate, the coal merchant, was cutting across the lower lane toward a customer's barn when movement near the Wickham fence caught his eye. Henry stood there just inside the boundary, facing the road. He wore a shirt too big for him, the sleeves rolled but slipping, and his hands hung straight at his sides. His hair was uncombed, his face pale against the deep green of the field beyond. Samuel slowed his steps and lifted a hand. "Afternoon, Henry," he called. The boy didn't answer. His eyes didn't even track Samuel's voice, as if fixed on a point far past him. The only movement was the faint sway of his shoulders with the breeze. Samuel hesitated, then stepped toward the fence. "Your mother about?" Henry's gaze shifted, not toward Samuel but slightly to the right, as though he were listening for something inside the house. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back toward the porch. The door opened before he reached it. Sarah stood in the frame, her hand resting on the wood, her figure blocking the view behind her. Even at a distance, Samuel saw her head turned toward him. There was no wave, no greeting, just a moment of stillness before she stepped inside and the door closed. Henry followed without looking back. Samuel told no one the details that day, only mentioned later that he'd seen one of the Wickham boys, as if the plain fact of that was enough. But the image stayed with him, the pale face, the too large shirt, the quiet way the child moved toward a house that seemed to pull him in like the shadow of a well. By late June, the boards over the upstairs windows had weathered to a dull grey. The path to the garden was almost hidden by tall grass, and on certain still nights, when the wind from the creek died entirely, a faint scent of something sweet and stale could be caught on the road. A smell that seemed to drift from the direction of the Wickham house, linger, and then dissolve into the summer air. It was this build-up, the silences, the smells, the shuttered windows, that began to trouble even those most committed to minding their own business. But trouble is not the same as action, and Mill Creek had yet to take that step. It would take another month and a sharper intrusion before anyone crossed the threshold with the intent to see what lay within. It was a thick afternoon in mid-July when the first complaint reached the sheriff's office. The summer air lay on Mill Creek like a heavy quilt, and even the water seemed to move slowly, carrying with it the scent of mud and weeds. Hattie McBride, who lived just west of the Wickham property, had been hanging laundry when a breeze from the east carried a different smell, sweet, heavy, and wrong. It wasn't the scent of flowers or ripened fruit, but something that made her throat tighten. She stepped down from her porch and followed it to the fence line. The odor was stronger there, drifting from the direction of the Wickham house. Hattie's husband suggested it might be a dead animal in the grass or near the creek bank, but she wasn't convinced. She'd known the smell of decay before, and this was laced with something else, an almost medicinal note that seemed to cling to the back of her tongue. The next morning she walked into town and told Sheriff Glay. The sheriff listened without interrupting, his hands folded over the notepad on his desk. When she finished, he asked if she'd spoken to Sarah herself. Hattie shook her head. She doesn't answer when I knock anymore, and it's not my place to push my way in. That afternoon, Glay rode out toward the bend. The road shimmered in the heat, and cicadas rattled in the hedges. As the Wickham house came into view, he noted the same shuttered windows, the same boards nailed over the upper window panes. The grass in the yard was high now, swaying against the wooden walls. No sound came from inside. He got off his horse and walked to the porch, where a small bundle wrapped in brown paper sat by the door. The paper was creased, the string dampened slightly by the humidity. When he bent to look, he saw the post office stamp from reading and a faint dark stain near one corner. The smell from it was faintly familiar, though he couldn't place it. He knocked. After a long pause, the door opened. Sarah stood there in a dark dress despite the heat, her hair pinned with the same precision he remembered. Her eyes were unreadable. "Afternoon, Mrs. Wickham," Glay said. "I wanted to check in. Some folks have been concerned. They say there's been an unusual smell." Sarah's gaze flickered past him toward the road, then back. "There's nothing here to concern anyone," she said evenly. "We are well. Are the children inside?" "They're resting. The heat makes them slow. I'd like to speak with them," Glay said. For a moment, her expression held steady. Then she shook her head, the motion small but firm. "Another day, perhaps. They've only just settled." Behind her in the dim hallway, he thought he heard the scrape of a chair leg against the floorboards, followed by stillness. She stepped back slightly, enough to close the door without force, but with the clear signal that the conversation was over. On the ride back to town, the smell Hattie had described seemed to cling to Glee's coat, faint but persistent. He thought of the parcel by the door, of the boards over the windows, of the way Sarah's voice carried no warmth at all. That evening he wrote a note in his record book. Possible welfare concern at Wickham property. No cause for entry. Monitor. It was a short entry, but one he found himself reading again 2 weeks later when another neighbor came with a complaint of the same smell, and something else besides. The second report came from a farmhand named Peter Lawn, who worked the Harper property just beyond the ridge. It was early August, the sun hanging thick in the sky, when Peter cut through the lane near the Wickhams on his way back from repairing a fence. As he passed, something at the edge of their porch caught his attention, a small shoe, caked in dried mud. It was a child's shoe, the kind worn for Sunday service, with a scuffed toe and a broken lace. Peter had seen Clara and Elsie wear similar ones in years past. What struck him was its placement, not dropped in haste, but lying beside the bottom step, half covered by wind-blown grass. He might have thought little of it, except that as he stood there, a stronger wave with a strange sweet smell rolled out from somewhere nearby. It was heavier now than it had been in July, and it clung in the still summer air like syrup. Peter glanced toward the house. The shutters were still in place. The boards upstairs had weathered to a dull grey. No movement came from within. On a sudden impulse, he stepped closer to the porch, intending to knock. That was when his eyes fell on the garden patch to the left of the house. It had been a tangle of weeds for months, but now one section near the corner was disturbed, the soil freshly turned, the shape of a shallow mound visible even from where he stood. A wooden-handled shovel leaned against the wall beside it. Flies hovered in slow, lazy spirals above the mound. A sudden prickle ran down Peter's neck. He took 2 steps back, his gaze snapping again to the porch. The front door remained shut. The only sound was the faint rasp of cicadas in the heat. By the time he reached the Harper's kitchen, Peter's hands were damp despite the dry air. He told Mrs. Harper what he'd seen. She listened, her brow tightening, and then insisted he go straight to the sheriff. That afternoon, Peter repeated his story in Glee's office, adding that the shoe by the step looked far too small to belong to Clara anymore. The sheriff's pen tapped against the desk as he considered. 2 complaints in less than a month, both about the smell. Now a fresh mound of earth, a child's shoe, and the same sense of isolation whenever he tried to speak to Sarah. "I can't walk into her house on a feeling," Glay said at last, "but I can ask the judge for a legal order to inspect the property. If she refuses entry, we'll of course." The paperwork was drawn up that evening. The following morning, the sheriff would ride out to the bend with Deputy Owen Bird, the order folded neatly in his pocket. Neither man yet knew that what waited behind the Wickham door would follow them the rest of their lives. The morning they set out was already warm, the sky pale and without clouds. Sheriff Glay and Deputy Owen Bird rode in silence along the lane to the bend, the order folded in the sheriff's coat pocket. Glay had been to the Wickham house twice in recent months, but the sense of unease he carried now was heavier. Peter Lawn's account of the shoe and the mound of earth had replayed in his mind through the night, mixing with the memory of Sarah's steady, unreadable gaze. When they reached the yard, the grass was high enough to brush their stirrup. The shutters were closed as before, the upstairs boards holding their dull grey against the wooden walls. The shovel Peter had mentioned leaned still against the wall beside the garden. The mound of soil sat in full view, darker than the ground around it. The sheriff got off his horse and walked up the porch steps. This time he didn't knock first. He called out, "Mrs. Wickham, we have a legal order to inspect the property." A pause, then the sound of a latch turning. The door opened, and Sarah stood there in a long dark dress, sleeves buttoned despite the heat. Her hair was pinned neatly, her posture composed. Her eyes moved from the sheriff to the deputy, then down to the paper in Glee's hand. "You came," she said, almost as if she'd been expecting them. "We need to look around, Mom," Glee said, his voice even. She stepped aside without protest. The air inside was cooler than the day outside, but it carried a weight, a faint, stale sweetness that clung to the back of the throat. The curtains were drawn tight, the light dim. The living room was, as Glee remembered, neat to the point of looking empty, no scattered toys or books. On the dining table, 4 plates sat empty but set. The forks were aligned with precision. Against the kitchen windowsill, Deputy Bird noticed 2 small glass bottles, both empty. One bore the printed label of a reading drug store, laudanum. "Where are the children, Mrs. Wickham?" Glee asked. "They're upstairs," she answered softly, resting. "It's been hard for them to find peace, but now they have it." Something in her tone made the hair rise on the back of the deputy's neck. Without another word, Glee crossed the living room and took the stairs 2 at a time. The smell intensified as he climbed. The bedroom on the left side of the landing was dim, the curtains tied shut with rope. The windows were boarded from the inside, pale wood against pale light. 4 small beds lined the walls. In each bed lay a child, the sheets pulled smooth, the faces pale and still. Clara, Henry, and Elsie, he knew them all. And a 4th bed that held a boy who could only be Henry's younger brother. Glee stepped to the nearest bed and touched the small wrist. Cold, no breath, no movement. Elsie's stiff fingers clutched a ragdoll. Henry's hair had been combed, the part straight and neat. The youngest lay curled slightly to one side, eyes closed, but not tightly shut. The sheriff's stomach turned. He checked each in turn, finding the same stillness, cold, and the unmistakable weight of death. Downstairs, Sarah had moved to a rocking chair in the corner of the living room. She was humming, the tune slow and unfamiliar. "They're safe now," she said when Glee returned to the room. "I did what I had to do." Bird's hands tightened at his sides. "What do you mean, safe?" "They won't have to feel the cold or the hunger," she said, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the deputy's shoulder. "The world can't take them now." The sheriff drew a breath and told Bird to send for the coroner immediately. Sarah made no protest as they informed her she would be taken into custody. She rose from the chair, smoothed her dress, and walked toward the door as though leaving for an afternoon visit. Outside, the heat struck hard, but Glee felt cold all the way through. The image of the 4 beds would not leave him. Neither would the words she had spoken, words that sounded not like confession, but like the closing of a task she had long prepared to finish. The coroner, Dr. Harlan Klee, arrived within the hour, his buggy raising small clouds of dust along the lane. With him came 2 assistants carrying canvas bags in the kind of solemn quiet that follows men who have seen too much of death in small towns. Sheriff Glee led them inside, past Sarah sitting calmly in a straight-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap. She did not look up as they passed. Upstairs, Dr. Klee moved slowly from bed to bed. He noted the cool temperature of the room despite the summer heat outside, the windows sealed and boarded to keep light and air from entering. Each child lay as if in sleep, their faces peaceful, without marks or signs of struggle. Elsie's lips were faintly discolored, the same as Clara's and Henry's. The youngest boy's small hand rested near his mouth, as if it had been placed there. When Klee examined the contents of their stomachs, the faint scent of laudanum rose unmistakably. The residue was mixed with what he identified as milk, still faintly sour from the heat, and traces of bread softened in it. "She gave it to them warm," he murmured to Glee, his voice low. "Enough to put each into a deep sleep they would never wake from." There was no evidence of force, no rope marks, no bruises. If the children had sensed anything wrong, it had been too late to resist. The doses had been precise, calculated to end without violence. Back downstairs, Deputy Bird continued searching. In the small writing desk in Sarah's bedroom, he found 3 slim notebooks. Each bore only dates and single lines written in a hand that pressed harder as the entries went on. May 16th, the quiet will be the mercy. My 21st, they asked me to keep them safe. Jan 8th, tomorrow we rest. In the bottom drawer of the desk was a narrow tin box. Inside were several folded letters unsent, each addressed to someone different: her late husband, her mother in Ohio, the minister, and one to no one at all. They were not requests for help. They were statements, calm and deliberate. To her husband, "You left too much behind for me to carry alone." To her mother, "You said I was too soft for this life. You were right. Softness absorbs until there is nothing left of itself." In the undated note to no one, the words were cold or still. "Don't call it cruelty. Call it mercy. It was the only form left to me." When Bird showed these to the sheriff, Glee read each without comment, his face set in a grim line. He ordered them collected as evidence, along with the 2 empty laudanum bottles from the kitchen windowsill. Meanwhile, Sarah remained in her chair, watching the dust particles drift in the slanted light. When Glee approached, she spoke before he could ask a question. "I couldn't let the winter come for them again," she said quietly. "It takes children slowly. I just made it quick." There was no tremor in her voice, no plea for understanding. It was as though she were reciting a truth she had come to long before this day. By the time the coroner's men carried the small, shrouded forms to the buggy, a few neighbors had gathered at the edge of the yard. None spoke. A pair of women held their aprons to their mouths. The sound of the wheels on the packed dirt was the only thing that followed the grim procession away from the Wickham house. Inside, the sheriff looked once more at Sarah before leading her outside. She stood without being told, smoothed the front of her dress, and walked to the waiting wagon as if heading toward a place she already knew. The formal investigation began the next morning, July 14th, in the sheriff's office. The notebooks, letters, and laudanum bottles were placed on the table alongside the coroner's preliminary report. Dr. Klee's findings were clear. Each child had swallowed a lethal dose of laudanum, likely given within minutes of one another. There were no injuries, no defensive marks, no signs of restraint. The sequence had been deliberate and measured. Sheriff Glay requested the assistance of Dr. Ezra Mallory, a physician from the county seat with experience in cases involving mental instability. Mallory examined Sarah in the holding room of the small jail where she was being kept under what they called protective watch. She was composed, answering questions directly but without emotion. Mallory began gently, asking about her children. "They were mine to keep," she said. "No one else could understand what they needed. No one else would do it right." When he asked why she had given them laudanum, she replied, "Because it's the kindest way to go." They slept. There was no hunger, no cold, no waiting for the world to take them in pieces. Her words were not hurried or defensive. Mallory noted in his report that she seemed fully aware of the nature of her actions but interpreted them through a moral framework that placed them as protective rather than harmful. In modern terms, he might have called it a fixed delusion shaped by grief and long isolation. Meanwhile, Deputy Bird continued cataloging the contents of the Wickham house. In a false panel beneath the floorboards of Sarah's closet, he found another bundle of letters, 9 in all, written between February and June of that year. They were addressed to various people but never sent. One to her late husband read, "I tell them you're in the soil now, growing into the wheat. They believe it, and that terrifies me. They believe everything I say." One to her mother, "Softness has a cost. It takes in every fear, every hunger, until I cannot find where I end and they begin." The most chilling was dated June 7th, the day before the coroner estimated the children had died. "I have sung them to sleep 1,000 times, but they always wake to more sorrow. This time I will hum until they stay sleeping. There will be no more winters without shoes." These letters were written in steady handwriting, without cross-outs, as if she had thought them through before ever setting pen to paper. Glay read them in silence, his hand resting on the desk. The evidence painted a picture that was both clear and difficult to accept. There had been no sudden rage, no momentary lapse. The act had been planned, justified in her own mind as an act of mercy. By the week's end, the judge ruled that Sarah would not be held in the county jail, but transferred to the state hospital for the insane in Harrisburg for full psychiatric evaluation. There her statements would be recorded in greater detail, and the question of her ability to stand trial would be decided. In Mill Creek, the news spread quietly. Neighbors spoke of the case in low tones, shaking their heads, not only at what had happened but at how long the signs had been there without anyone stepping forward. Some still avoided speaking her name, as though it might carry something with it. Others could not stop turning over the same question: if someone had knocked harder sooner, could the children still be alive? At the time of the Wickham case, the law in Pennsylvania left wide gaps when it came to matters of mental illness. The concept of an insanity defense existed, but it was rarely used outside major cities, and rural counties often had neither the resources nor the willingness to see such cases through. In places like Mill Creek, moral judgment tended to outweigh legal process, and the common view was that wrongdoing should be met with punishment, not examination. Yet Sarah's case didn't fit neatly into the framework of crime as the community understood it. She hadn't fled, hadn't hidden what she had done, and in every interview, she spoke with a calm conviction that unsettled the people who heard it. She insisted that she had acted out of protection, not evil intent. "The world takes children in its own time," she told Dr. Mallory in Harrisburg. "I only made it quicker. Quicker is kinder." When her letters and notebooks were quietly passed to medical examiners for review, they drew a different kind of attention. The handwriting was steady, the grammar precise, but the ideas spiraled inward, narrowing around a single point: the belief that only she could shield her children from unavoidable harm. One examiner described it as fortress logic, sealed from influence, fortified over years of grief. The more the investigators learned, the more they realized this tragedy was not unique. Dr. Mallory shared with Glay accounts from neighboring counties, cases in which widowed mothers, isolated and without support, had acted in similar ways. Some used laudanum, others simply withheld food or heat in the belief that it spared their children from worse fates. Most of these women were declared unfit to stand trial and disappeared into state hospitals, their stories reduced to a line in a record book. There was, for example, the case of Margaret Reeve in Perry County, who in 1887 gave her 2 children doses of morphine to keep them warm forever during a brutal winter, or Lydia Cross in Union County, who in 1890 was found sitting beside her 3 lifeless children, telling a neighbor she'd sent them where the frost can't reach. None of these women had previous records of violence. All had been living in rural isolation after the loss of a husband or primary breadwinner. The parallels disturbed Glay. In his private notes, kept in the back of his record book long after the official file was closed, he wrote, "It is not the madness of a moment. It is a long hunger for help that never comes, for relief that never arrives. By the time anyone knocks, the door is no longer a door. It is a wall." In Mill Creek, these broader comparisons never reached public ears. People spoke only of Sarah and her children, and even that grew less frequent as the weeks passed. The house on the bend stood silent, the grass rising higher in the yard, the boards over the windows holding against the summer storms. For some, it was a place to avoid. For others, it was a fixed point in their walks to town, a grim marker of what happens when a family slips entirely behind its own walls. But to those who had known the children, there was no avoiding the memory. Clara's quick smile, Henry's quiet watchfulness, Elsie's little laugh. They were the counterweights to the silence that now defined the Wickham name. And though the community might not have spoken of it openly, the question that lingered was one they could not dismiss: how many other homes hid the same silence behind their doors? Sarah Wickham was admitted to the Pennsylvania State Hospital in Harrisburg on August 3, 1892. The entry in the register listed her age as 34, occupation as housewife, and cause for admission as melancholia with fixed delusions. She was placed in a ward for female patients considered non-violent, though the staff were warned that she required close observation. From the beginning, her routine was unshakably orderly. She rose at dawn, made her bed with precise corners, and dressed in the same plain dark garments she had worn when she arrived. She spoke when spoken to, but rarely started conversation. The nurses noted a habit of setting places at an empty table, 4 plates, 4 cups, each aligned as if waiting for a small hand to reach for them. When asked about it, she would smile faintly and say, "They'll be along." In the hospital's day room, she often sat by the tall windows, her sewing basket in her lap. The garments she mended were tiny, socks no larger than a palm, the sleeves of small dresses, though no such clothing existed in the ward. She worked with quiet concentration, threading dark thread through fabric until the light shifted in the windows. Occasionally, during quiet times, she would hum under her breath. It was not a recognizable hymn or lullaby, but the same low, measured tune Sheriff Glay had heard in her living room on the day of the arrest. When a nurse asked her about it, she answered simply, "It helps them sleep." Years passed with little change. The staff observed no violent outbursts, no signs of agitation, only an unyielding detachment from the reality around her. New patients came and went, but Sarah's place in the ward remained constant, her daily rituals unchanged. In 1905, a young nurse named Margaret Evans joined the hospital staff and was assigned to Sarah's ward. She later wrote in her diary about her first evening there. She sat with her back to me, arranging invisible cups before her. She nodded as though in reply to someone I could not hear. When she turned, her expression was gentle, but her eyes were far away. I asked who she had been speaking to. "The children," she said, as though I were the one who had forgotten. By the 1910s, age had begun to touch her. Her hair graying at the temples, her posture bending slightly, but the routines persisted. On certain cold nights, she would ask the nurses if extra coal had been brought in. "They don't like to wake up cold," she'd say, and the staff, uncertain how to answer, would simply nod and adjust the fire. No one in Mill Creek came to visit. Her mother had died in Ohio not long after Sarah's admission, and her few remaining relatives had long since moved away. For the town, she was no longer a presence, only a name attached to an old story that most preferred not to tell. In January 1913, a hospital physician noted in her file that her health was declining. She was still cooperative and calm, but her heart was weak, and she tired easily. On the last day of that month, she failed to rise from bed for the first time in her decades there. When a nurse asked if she was in pain, she shook her head and murmured, "We made it through the storm. They're warm now. That's all I ever wanted." She died that night in her sleep. Her remains were cremated, and no family claimed them. The ashes were buried in the hospital's numbered graveyard under a small marker that read only Patient 241. The Wickham house stood empty for years after Sarah was taken away. At first, the sheriff's office kept it locked, its contents recorded and left to gather dust. The garden grew wild, weeds climbing the porch steps, vines curling into the gaps between wooden boards. Children dared each other to run to the front door and touch it, then flee back to the safety of the road. Some claimed they saw shapes at the upstairs windows, though the boards still held firm. Others whispered of a faint humming drifting from the house on windless nights. By 1896, the county placed the property up for auction. No one bid. Twice more they tried, and twice the offers failed to meet even the lowest asking price. The house became part of the landscape the way a scar does, noticed at first, then simply absorbed into the whole. Passing it required no comment, only the slight tightening of a jaw or the brief glance away. In the winter of 1901, a lightning storm swept across Mill Creek. A bolt struck the rear roofline of the Wickham house, setting fire to the dry timbers in the attic. By the time the neighbors noticed, the flames had already eaten through the upper floor. The volunteer brigade arrived too late to save anything but the shell. What remained collapsed inward, leaving only the stone foundation, a charred outline of walls. The county cleared the debris the following spring, leveling the ground. No one rebuilt there. The lot grew over with grass and wildflowers, and in summer, the hum of bees replaced the creak of shutters. Yet the story of Sarah and her children never truly left Mill Creek. It traveled in low voices at the edge of gatherings, in the private confessions of those who had seen something and done nothing. Some spoke of guilt, how they might have knocked harder, asked differently, stepped past the threshold. Others defended their silence as respect for privacy, a value that in this place was nearly sacred. Years later, long after the house was gone, a young woman tending her grandmother's garden found a child's shoe buried at the edge of the property, scuffed, its leather worn soft with age. It fit easily in her hand. The grandmother, who had been a girl during the time of the Wickhams, took it without surprise and set it on a shelf in the kitchen. When asked about it, she only said, "Some things belong to the past, but the past doesn't always agree." The graves of Clara, Henry, and Elsie rest in the small cemetery on the rise beyond the church. Their markers are simple: first names, birth and death years, nothing more. Fresh flowers appear there from time to time, though no one admits to leaving them. In the stillness of that place, the story of the Wickham house lingers, not as a tale of evil, but as a caution about what happens when need is hidden behind closed doors, and no one chooses to see. There are tragedies that fade with the generation that remembers them, and others that remain as a quiet presence woven into the identity of a place. In Mill Creek, the memory of Sarah Wickham is not told in the town's official history. It exists instead in the pauses between words, in the way neighbors glance at shuttered houses, in the knowledge that silence, left alone long enough, can become its own kind of storm. And perhaps that is the real legacy.